To another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard, and today we are going to continue our series about Hegel, learning about Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit with the help of Dr. Sadler here. So, I totally forgot to write the description of the last video, the summary of the last video, so just gonna have to read uh, Dr. Sadler's here. So he says in the last section, Hegel discusses some of the issues involved with speculative philosophy and language. Speculative, speculative philosophy involves a different use and approach to language, one which cannot be grasped adequately from the perspective of the argumentative rationative mode. At the same time, he affirms that non-speculative speculative uses of language have their scope of legitimacy, and he points out. I feel like I reread this before, did this before, but I didn't see it in my thing. Let me double check. For some reason, it sounds like we did the section. I don't think so though. 64 and 66. Yeah, this is correct. Oh, okay. Anyways, to continue, he points out that even speculative philosophy is stuck using the same language as all the other modes of thought and expression. He then gives us an interesting example of subject not to begin with, God. Of a subject not to begin with, God. Yeah. So don't begin with that one. And the reason why he pointed it out is because when you think about like God, right, as a subject, you often think about it as a sort of name, if you will, right, as a title, as opposed to actually embracing or engaging in the idea of what God might be. So a better example of to view that same concept as a subject would be something like being, right? It's just kind of speculative enough so that it encourages your curiosity, but not so specific, right? That you're thinking about a specific name or what it's supposed to be. You're thinking about what it can be, in essence, which I find very interesting because it goes back to the more I'm going to say interesting, kind of concepts of religion. I've been hearing a little bit about Thomas, I think Aquinas, who's a religious philosopher. So I really want to look up his stuff. He seems to have some really interesting takes. But we'll jump into it. Without further ado.
The study of philosophy is as much hindered by the conceit that will not argue as it is by the argumentative approach. This conceit relies on truths which are taken for granted and which it sees no need to re-examine. It just lays them down and believes it is entitled to assert them as well as to judge and pass sentence by appealing to them.
Mm.
In view of this, it is especially necessary that philosophizing should again be made a serious business. In the case of all other sciences, arts, skills, and crafts, everyone is convinced that a complex and laborious program of learning and practice is necessary for competence.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, when it comes to philosophy, there seems to be a currently prevailing prejudice to the effect that, although not everyone who has eyes and fingers and is given leather and last is at once in a position to make shoes, everyone nevertheless immediately understands how to philosophize and how to evaluate philosophy, since he possesses the criterion for doing so in his natural reason, as if he did not likewise possess the measure for a shoe in his own foot.
What's really interesting about this too is that this seems to be the case not just for philosophy, even today, 200 years after he wrote this, but also for many other subjects of expertise that are more based in like the soft sciences, right? More based in the social skills. So take for instance my own industry of design, right? We have this whole thing of design thinking today, and everybody can be a designer or everybody can be a researcher, and it sounds like a good enough thing, like oh yeah, democratizing knowledge and stuff like that. But that's not what is actually going on. What's going on is that people don't value, right, the amount of effort and the amount of rigor it takes to actually be a good designer, right? Likewise, it's like saying everybody can be a coder. maybe everybody can learn a little bit about how to code, but not everybody can go and code you an app, right? And you can see this in the past couple of years where people are like, "Oh yeah, you can code, right? Come make me an app." I'm like, "No, it's not that easy." It's extremely it's a lot of effort and expertise and um different types of knowledge that goes into it, right? You can't just slap it together. Same thing for design, even for things like marketing, right? Social media marketing, right? They think any young person can just go on social media and be the social media marketer, but it actually takes a good amount of experience and effort and skills to actually grow a social media channel, right? To be a quote unquote influencer, that's a certain type of skill set. But because it's this sort of in the zone of, I suppose, soft science or something that is almost immaterial in a way that's like not rigid numbers, people tend to uh yeah, just like devalue it. People tend to think that, oh, anybody can do this thing, right? There's no real rigor involved, but of course there is.
As if he did not likewise possess the measure for a shoe in his own foot. It seems that philosophical competence consists precisely in an absence of information and study, as though philosophy left off where they began. Philosophy is frequently taken to be a purely formal kind of knowledge, void of content, and the insight is sadly lacking that whatever truth there may be in the content of any discipline or science, it can only deserve the name if such truth has been engendered by philosophy.
Hmm.
Let the other sciences try to argue as much as they like without philosophy.
Mhm.
Without it, they can have in them neither life, spirit, nor truth.
Mm. And again, you can see this very much in today's scientists. It's really unfortunate because, like, if you listen to scientists talk, oftentimes they would be in their bag in their own when they're in their subject, but then they go off into all this other stuff and therefore this means that about the universe and all this other stuff. But I'm like, if you knew anything about philosophy or psychology or sociology or any of these other ologies or whatever, you would see why this argument makes no sense. Just because you're super smart physicist, right, or super smart computer programmer, doesn't mean you know how the human mind works, or you understand phenomenology, or can dictate how the universe works on a philosophical level. Like, this stuff requires its own set of rigor, and your expertise in your knowledge base in your vertical, whether it's science, computers and all this other stuff, that does not necessarily translate, right? You would have to go through the same effort you took to become a master programmer or scientist or whatever. That same amount needs to go into philosophy or psychology or any of these other things that you're trying to know some things about. And this is why another reason why I do this channel and delve into these other subjects, because I want to be able to talk about these things at a deep level. So I don't want to just be a one trick pony and only really know about design or whatever. I want to cross pollinate with all these other subjects. So I naturally kind of delve deep as I can into as many different subjects as I can.
Section 67 is this great passage that ends with this statement that let the other sciences try to argue as much as they like without philosophy. Without it, they can have in them neither life, spirit, nor truth. That's a bold statement on Hegel's part, and you might say, what does that got to do with all the things that I've sketched up here? Well, when the other sciences, the other disciplines, the other fields of knowledge are asserting themselves, but they're doing so in a way against philosophy or just sort of dismissing it, taking it for granted, not being adequately philosophical themselves, they end up limiting themselves without actually realizing it, and they are going to lapse either into this side or into this side, whether we grasp it or not. So it's not like we have four terms here, the argumentative, raisonnier
I have to speed this up,
the sort of
know how I be.
commonsensical, don't bother me with your reasoning, I've got facts on my side sort of approach, philosophical science, and then other sciences. What he's saying is, if other sciences are not adequately philosophical, they don't stay here, they wind up on this side, or they wind up on this side. probably a weird hybrid mixture of both. So let's look at these two approaches. We've got the argumentative approach, and we've got the conceit that will not argue. And we've looked a lot at the argumentative approach already. We don't need to say an awful lot more about it. It's overly critical. It's taking advantage of the fact that subjectivity is in fact negativity, the fact that the world is not a completely finished product, the fact that we can look at things from multiple perspectives to tear things down, to say that's not any good. And it ends up in what he calls a vanity or futility, a skeptical standpoint that we're going to see come up over and over again. That is, it's not satisfying. It doesn't satisfy what the reasoning human being actually needs. And what's the opposite of skepticism? Kind of dogmatism. And oftentimes people want that sort of thing precisely because they feel the pain of being caught in this void where things don't seem to matter, so they latch on to something. And every culture has some of these positions to offer, at least some of its members. Our culture has a wide array of things that you could sort of ready-made step into and be part of. You want to be an unthinking Christian, that's quite possible. You want to be an unthinking atheist, that's quite possible. They're both as equally backward, stupid, undialectical as each other. You want to have the sort of vantage point of being the Christian critic. You want to be the atheist critic. You want to play around with criticism, but not actually apply it to yourself and see that your standpoint might need some dialectical retooling. Knock yourself out. There's websites devoted to that sort of thing. You want to be a stoic and read Epictetus and walk around with the Enchiridion in your back pocket and pop out quotes every once in a while. You can do that in a sort of blockheaded, here's my dogma kind of way, or you can also do that in a I'm going to criticize everything from the standpoint of Stoicism kind of way. Or you could actually read Epictetus. You probably have to read more than just the Enchiridion. You have to read the discourses too. That the Enchiridion is a best hits of, but you'd have to actually think through these things. And Hegel saying philosophy, real philosophy, is going to occupy a kind of not an Aristotelian mean place, but something in between these two. Let's look now over here at this Einbildung, this conceit, as Miller is translating it, that will not argue. It says, the study of philosophy is as much hindered by the conceit that will not argue as it is by the argumentative approach that gets things wrong and thinks that because it can argue against things and raise objections that put an end to the development of the dialectic.
In essence, I know this is kind of a little bit off topic, but I keep thinking back to this, kind of spectrum here. The argumentative, to me, sounds like debate bros, right? The debate bros side of YouTube or social media or Twitch, whatever, and they're just debating, they're just arguing back and forth about stuff. And very rarely do they ever get into the meat of the subject, or, oftentimes they get, off the beaten path, talking about these little, pinpoints that they can try to get over on each other on. But uh, you don't really get to create a firm foundation around the knowledge or the information space that you're trying to learn about. While the other side is like the the I don't want to say political, because honestly, political is everything, right? I hate that term of, oh, don't be political. But what I mean here is like the people who complain about the other side, right? And so, for instance, you have you have these liberals saying, oh, this is what the Reds want, this is what the Reds or conservatives want, or they're trying to do. And look at these facts and all this other stuff, but they're not really engaging with the full again, the full information space. They just kind of have their mindset on what is the truth, and they kind of ignore everything else. While on the other side, of course, you have the conservatives who are honestly kind of worse in many ways. um, they're saying, "Oh, this is this is what they're the whole Q thing, right? This is what they're what they call it, the understate, the dark state." The deep state, yeah, the deep state. This is what they're trying to do. They got their agenda set up and all this other stuff. So they they have a conceit about what their knowledge is or what their truth is, right? And they're just trying to fit everything into that a little mold. Um, but that neither of those are actual philosophy. Neither of those get to the truth of the matter. Philosophy is the process of building this foundation of knowledge in which you're engaging with all these different sides to it, right? So it requires you to have that, that dialectical approach, to have conversations, to have discussions, to think about a subject as something different from itself, and bring it back in and see how it differs from what you thought it was, and let it lead you and all this other stuff. It's a very intensive process, right? So it's of course it's hard to do, and it's something that a lot of people will do. But yeah, it's very, once again, amazing how relevant this is to this day.
This conceit relies on truths which are taken for granted and which it sees no reason to re-examine. It just lays them down and believes itself entitled to assert them as well to judge and pass sentence by appealing to them. How often do we see people raising objections because they are a fan of Bertrand Russell or Ayn Rand, and Bertrand Russell said this, or Ayn Rand said this, or, pick newer people. Richard Dawkins said this, or, I should probably pick on a few theists as well. You can read Augustine in a kind of a blockheaded, I'm going to take everything for granted sort of way. Although, if you really read Augustine,
Jordan Peterson said that.
You can say, Augustine said this, or you can be one
Stephen
of
Crowder
those,
said
those
that.
Thomists who's what I call a fundamentalist of the Summa. Look, it says it here on this page, Thomas put an end to that question. Or, you don't even have to go to philosophy to do that. Neuroscientists have told me this because I saw this thing on the Gawker. Or,
Elon Musk said this.
All about who's a racist, who's a sexist, who's a classist, who's a thisist, who's a thatist, because I saw this issue, this blog post in Jezebel. That's basically just consumer culture of the mind there.
RedTube.
That's what Hegel's actually talking about. It can be just relying on textbooks. It can be just reading the newest thing that pops up. The whole point here is that somebody has a few thoughts and they don't bother to re-examine them. They're not doing anything dialectical with them because they're not saying, well, are these really sufficient? Can these actually say something about themselves? Do they self-other? What don't they include? Can they extend to what it is that they don't include? Can they address rival points of view? The person here doesn't feel the need to do that because they already know it. They've already got it figured out. Maybe if they don't have the whole universe figured out, they've got their town figured out, they've got their house figured out, they've got their laboratory figured out, they've got their church figured out. They don't need to be bothered with anything else. So he says, in view of this, it's especially necessary that philosophy should again be made a serious business. Too many people, in Hegel's time, in his view, are puttering around with philosophy. There's too many dilettantes involved in the game, and that's giving things a bad name. By the way, there's a new thing. Read the Republic, and you'll see Socrates saying the same thing. Philosophy is being, given a bad rap by all these people who are doing a crap job with it, and somebody ought to come along and do philosophy right.
Look at that, like from freaking Socrates all the way up to Hegel to today. This is a fundamental problem with communication, right, among humans, and that's something that we should really, be worried about. The fact that, granted, the fact that we can have these communications is amazing, but the fact that this has been a problem about philosophy, about engaging in meaningful philosophy and meaningful conversation for hundreds of years, for millennia, we need to think about how to do this better, right? How to be more sustainable or more scalable with good conversation, with meaningful communication.
He was talking about himself in that case, right? So he says, in the case of all the other sciences, arts, skills, and crafts, everyone is convinced that a complex and laborious program of learning and practice is necessary for competence. You see where this is going, don't you? Why isn't that the case for philosophy? Ask yourself, too. Is it different in our time than it is in the time that Hegel's complaining about?
No, still a problem.
How many people throw the word philosophy around and have no clue what it means? Or just the dimmest idea? Or they've read one book and they've really read it well. They've read Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy, and now they know about the whole history and they know where everybody fits in. And they never bothered to question whether Russell was a biased source. Even worse if they read the Durant's History of Philosophy. Source that's not particularly good. That's one. Why is it that there's apprenticeship programs in all these skills, and you wouldn't hire somebody to do work for you who doesn't know what they're doing, who doesn't have a certificate, who hasn't earned the right to call themselves a journeyman? But you're perfectly fine with anybody whatsoever calling themselves a philosopher, or all people out there who have no idea what philosophy is, talking about this person's a philosopher, that person's a philosopher. I mean, why get upset about Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking denigrating philosophy, unless you actually have put in the time to know what philosophy could mean, going beyond, say, just an intro class, unless you had a really good intro teacher and a really good intro text and you really applied yourself. See, these are important questions, and they're perennial questions. When it comes to other things, we think that there's a body of knowledge out there that you have to acquire. Not only do you have to learn information, you have to undergo a formation of yourself. That information has to become a part of you. Not that you become a walking encyclopedia, but that you're able to apply that knowledge. You're able to figure out what applies at what time, what's relevant, what's not relevant. You're able to see how things fit together.
Beautiful.
Why would it be any different for philosophy if philosophy actually means something? Now, philosophy is just, as Mel Brooks, conveyed, as I've heard so many times when I tell people that I'm a philosopher, being a bullshit artist, then presumably there's no actual skill. But it's interesting, because other people who are essentially bullshit artists, meaning artists who work with various types of bullshit. Sales, for example, there's a thing called salesmanship. You can actually teach somebody how to sell things better, how to, read the customer, what to say, what not to say. There's a body of knowledge. Comedy, very difficult thing to do. It's not so easy to be funny. Good comics put a lot of thought into it. They study each other. The same thing has to go for philosophy. You cannot be a philosopher just going off and pretending to be Descartes and meditate, on things by yourself, or with your little friends circle over there who went to that particular institution and read those 5 articles and trade them back and forth. You can't really do philosophy well without seeing what other people in the field are doing, without trying to make their achievements your own and trying to assimilate that and then try to move past them. So he says, what's the problem here? A lot of people will, for example, when it comes to shoemaking, that's not something we can relate to so easy, but shoemaking, they think that it's not enough just to give somebody leather and some tools and say, all right, make me some shoes. You actually have to know what you're doing. Let's think about in terms of culinary.
Today is like
something
code.
that we can relate to a little bit more in our culture, which is foodie obsessed and has a whole bunch of cooking shows and things like that. You can actually watch a famous chef put together one of these great recipes and follow along and say, oh, that's a cool ingredient, and then watch the judges eat them, and oh, I taste the saffron in that. You can do that. That doesn't make you a chef. You walk into the kitchen and start getting your ingredients out and start working with them. You'll figure out real quick whether watching cooking shows is actually going to convey expertise to you.
Exactly.
Buying cookbooks, that's not enough either. It probably helps to take a cooking class. Or, like in my case, it probably helps to have had a formation when you were a child, having a mother who was essentially a gourmet cook, who would spend hours on meals, and we would sit there as kids and watch her, or sometimes we'd apprentice by she'd say, all right, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to do this. I know how to break down a chicken because I saw my mother do it. Time after time after time. I know what a chicken heart tastes like because those were the little delicacies that she kept for us when she was turning a chicken into 3 meals. And she'd give them to myself and my sister. That's what philosophy is like as well.
Yes.
The problem is that everybody assumes that because they've got natural reason or common sense or some critical thinking capacities over here, that they're up to doing philosophy in a serious way. It doesn't mean that they can't, write a philosophy paper, they can't read Plato, they can't read Hegel, but they have to acknowledge the fact that they're beginners or journeymen or intermediates. They're not at the level of the masters quite yet. Perhaps they're not even equipped to make judgments about the masters. So he says, everyone nevertheless immediately understands how to philosophize, how to evaluate philosophy, since he possesses the criterion for doing so in his natural reason. You might as well say, Hegel says, and this is a great response, that, well, you possess the criterion for shoemaking because you got a foot. Or you possess the criterion for culinary arts because you got a mouth. Like tongue, taste buds, and that sort of thing. Or, hey, you're a musician because you got some ears. No, it's not quite so simple as that. It's a laborious process. So he says, it seems to these people as if philosophical competence consists precisely in an absence of information and study, as if philosophy left off where they began. And, some philosophers have actually been quite detrimental in saying things like, well, philosophy is just thinking without making any presuppositions, or it's like non-dogmatic, or it's different from the other disciplines in that it has no content. Hegel would say, that's nonsense. You guys are actually giving a false image of philosophy to people. You're doing a disservice to them and to yourself and to philosophy as a result. So he says, the insight is sadly lacking that whatever truth there may be in the content of any discipline or science, it can only deserve the name as such truth has been engendered by philosophy. Now, does that mean that, unless a philosopher came up with an important biological principle, it's not really any good? No, but probably that biologist who came up with that was doing philosophy and not calling it philosophy at the time. We go back to Protagoras, in Plato's dialogue, where Protagoras said that many people are sophists. They just are doing, things undercover, so to speak. Plato would be willing to say that, to a certain extent, those who are actually thinking about the grounds of their discipline, thinking the big thoughts, thinking the ones that really matter, are doing philosophy. They're doing philosophy of this, they're doing philosophy of that, and it gets reincorporated into the discipline, but it is doing philosophy. If you're thinking about whether you've actually got stuff right in how you're applying things in your discipline, you're probably doing epistemology, you're doing critical thinking. If you're making arguments about your discipline, you're doing rhetoric or you're doing logic or dialectic. If you're...
Dr. Sadler is going off too. Like Hegel was going off, but now I see, Dr. Sadler over here. He's feeling this. He's feeling this section, and I don't blame him because I'm sure he has experienced a lot of this in his own life as a philosopher, teacher, as a philosopher. He's probably had to field countless questions and critiques and arguments from people who are just completely ignorant of the field. Probably not even just from everyday people, but he's probably experienced this from other instructors, right? From other people in academics who were physicists, and like I was saying earlier, like people who were really good in their field, but then tried to assume that they could be a philosopher too, without doing any of the work, right? So I know he's probably venting some of that too. So I'm just letting him talk because 100% I agree, and I'm new to all of this, and I can see this already. Like I've seen it in my own field with design, and I've seen it with VR, and I've seen it with other stuff. So it's really interesting, yeah.
Thinking about what is the nature of the thing that I'm actually working with, how should I comprehend it? You're probably doing metaphysics. If you're thinking about, what are the important implications for how human beings relate to each other, and what this means about human beings, you're doing philosophical anthropology. And we
Exactly.
could go on down the list for aesthetics, for ethics, for political philosophy, for philosophy of language, a whole bunch of different fields all rolled into philosophy that permeate the other fields. This is Hegel's standpoint on that. When this
Every
gets
time you
lost
ask
sight of, the
why
disciplines
something
go this
works.
way or they go this way.
Mm.
When philosophy itself loses sight of the need to be rigorous, the need to be a serious business, it winds up over here or winds up over here and doesn't do anybody any good.
Yes. Mm.
In place of the long process of culture towards genuine philosophy, a movement as rich as it is profound, through which spirit achieves knowledge, we are offered as quite equivalent either direct revelation from heaven, or the sound common sense that has never labored over or informed itself regarding other knowledge of genuine philosophy. And we're assured that these are quite as good substitutes as some claim chicory is for coffee.
Mm.
It is not a pleasant experience to see ignorance and a crudity without form or taste which cannot focus its thought on a single abstract proposition, still less on a connected chain of them, claiming at one moment to be freedom of thought and toleration, and at the next to be even genius. Genius, we all know, was once all the rage in poetry as it now is in philosophy. But when its productions made sense at all, such genius begat only trite prose instead of poetry, or getting beyond that, only crazy rhetoric.
Oh my gosh, hold up. And I've talked about this too in the very beginning, right? Talking about how folks, like I see this in hip hop, for instance, folks would swear, oh, this artist, they're a genius, they're amazing, when really they're not really saying anything, right? What he said here, genius, what we all know is once the raging poetry. And this is like with rap nowadays, right? With folks like Hobson or Logic, they say, oh, or now it's Dax or something like that, right? Genius begot only the prose instead of poetry, or getting beyond that, only crazy rhetoric, right? Crazy rhetoric point to what's his name? Freaking like folks like Joyner Lucas, or you got folks like what's his name? Tom McDonald, right? Who just kind of spout some stuff that people wish they would say, and people like, oh yeah, they're speaking the truth, but they're not actually delving deep into this subject, right? They're not actually embracing or self-analyzing, or um, doing any sort of rigor around the topic that they're rapping about. And yet people want to point that out as like the most genius thing ever. When in reality, you got folks like Denzel Curry, actually delving deep into these topics. You got folks like freaking Black Thought. You got folks like King Los. You got folks like Lupe, delving deep into this. Kendrick, of course, delving deep into these topics. So it really bothers me, to see that sort of thing. And it's once again relevant. It's crazy how this is pointed out 200 years ago with poetry, and now you see this same thing happen with the new age poetry with rap, and it probably happens in a lot of other music as well. Um, so yeah, it's just Hegel, man, beautiful. Like again, this is only the introduction. This is only the prologue, and I've already like gained so much insights. I'm really excited to get further into this.
All, such genius begat only trite prose instead of poetry, or getting beyond that, only crazy rhetoric. So nowadays, philosophizing by the light of nature, which regards itself as too good for the notion, and as being an intuitive and poetic thinking in virtue of this deficiency, brings to market the arbitrary combinations of an imagination that has only been disorganized by its thoughts, an imagery that is neither fish nor flesh, neither poetry nor philosophy.
I like that line. Hold up, I like that line. Brings to market only the arbitrary combinations of an imagination that has only been disorganized by its thoughts. And imagery that, yeah, this. Oh my gosh, gotta might have to put that on the tweet too.
Section 68 is going to bring back up some old enemies, some old objects of criticism that Hegel has already several times addressed in the course of this preface. And at this point, you might actually be saying, yeah, come on, Hegel, that's enough. But we're getting close to the end of the preface, so bear with him for a moment. There's a really important point that's being made here. He's not actually using the term that we use nowadays, which we might call presentism. And when we're talking about that, what we mean is judging everything from the standpoint of the present. It's often used by historians who want to say that, if we want to understand ancient Greece, we can't just take our categories of understanding and just sort of like paste them back onto ancient Greece. For example, a lot of times people want to say, well, ancient Greece as an entire culture, as a civilization, as if there was such a thing, that you could generalize about in such ways, was much more open to and accepting of homosexuality than the last, say, 200, 300 years of Western culture had been until fairly recently. And their evidence for that will be, looking at things like, Plato's Symposium and the jokes that are being made there, discussions about male-male homosexual relations, Sappho's poetry, all sorts of things like that. And what's important to keep in mind is that the Greeks didn't understand the difference between homosexual, heterosexual in quite the way that we did. For them, and
Mm,
also for the Romans, and again, we're really generalizing, really painting things with a broad brush here. It doesn't apply in every case, but they tended to see it less in terms of is there a same-sex attraction or intercourse or something like that, and they much more tended to see the pejorative aspect of it as being penetrated. So it's fine to be the
mm,
penetrator, not so good to be the penetratee. And so, if you actually want analogies to this, we have to talk about something much more like,
like
the
top bottom
download
type of thing.
culture,
Yeah.
where people say, well, I'm not really homosexual because I'm the one who's penetrating, where there's some opprobrium attached to that, right?
Mm,
Presentism would read back all that sort of stuff. Or they would say, for example, well, the ancient Greeks, if we want to make them out to be bad guys, look at that jerk Aristotle saying that women are defective men, or that some people naturally deserve to be slaves. Well, we know from the present perspective that that's not the case, so what a dummy he was. What a
mhm.
dummy all those Greeks were to have slavery. The problem with this is that it's assuming that our present vantage point is the one that sort of counts for consciousness throughout
Mhm.
all of history. And it doesn't see history in a Hegelian fashion as a set of advances of consciousness, which, by the way, I should include this too, oftentimes include options where you could be going up to
Right.
the next
Good.
phase, but you could also
Or
be
just go
declining. You
down.
could also
Yeah.
be falling back.
Yeah. This is. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I should probably let him talk, but this is a really, really strong point here, and there's a lot of things that were coming to mind. That's why I had to pause it. But you see this in America, a lot today with extremism and things like that, and people trying to go back to neo-Nazi times or whatever. Um, and saying all this crap like we're supposed to be at a time like you would think that we would we would get better with our morals and our ideas of consciousness and freedom and all this other stuff, but in many ways you see a kind of decline in freedom and things like that, and even how we define freedom, simply because people don't really have a you know a strong foundation of what freedom actually means. They kind of use that as a term for their own kind of desires, but don't really analyze it, right? Don't really critique it. They have the conceit, if you will. um, and because of that, I think at least we very much fall. We like kind of go downhill, like we're showing here, and what what would otherwise be a forward movement, a forward and up movement of our consciousness, our understanding of what's right and wrong. That goes to the idea that right and wrong is not necessarily universal, right? It's contextual. It depends on where you're born and when you're born and what's the current moods of that space is. But some other things that have been on my mind with this when I thought about presentism is like how we think about again freedom today, how we think about hierarchy today. We kind of assume today that um, you know like this goes into the Hobbesian and what do you call it? What's his name? Rousseau. Their idea of civilization, right? The idea that we have been kind of on a linear path of civilization, and it came from a primitive time of barbarians or whatever, and to a more advanced time of where we are today. But in reality, that's it's not really a straight shot, nor is it, nor do they like the ideas of what we have today for what is hierarchy and what is civilization assumes that things like written records or statism, having states and government means that you are more advanced or more you know uh, yeah, more advanced in terms of your civilization. But in the context of those times, right? And for instance, hunter-gatherer cultures, and getting a little bit into anthropology here, but they thought about hierarchy in a completely different way, right? It wasn't that it was more advanced, and even during a Neolithic revolution, as cities were developing and states were developing and stuff like that, many people turned away from cities, right? Many people left the cities because the cities were dirty, right? They were disgusting. They were that's where that's where the first pandemics came from, is people coming together in these cities and living amongst these animals and all this other stuff, and having all these people in one place. It was terrible to live in a city. It was terrible to farm for a long period of time, for hundreds if not thousands of years, right? So it was not really clear that living in the city would be better than having a nomadic culture, right? So to view those people, like nomadic cultures, as primitive, as less um, aware than where we are today, or as stupid, right? Is similar to how to this conversation. It's very silly because it reduces, all that context into this pseudo linear nature of development. So yeah, it's super relevant.
Back to previous phases. History, for Hegel, is a hard-won set of achievements that we should not write off. We should not treat as, sort of consumer commodity culture for the intellectual life, or for, upworthy articles or things like that. We should actually have a certain kind of reverence towards the brutal labor that was required to dig ourselves out from our previous ways of seeing the world, our previous understandings of the human condition. Here's a great example. Hegel says that, the human species as a whole had to develop from an understanding of power relations in terms of tyranny, moving to aristocracy, and then finally moving to something like democracy. And that politically that happened early, but in terms of the spiritual life, that didn't happen, in terms of truth, that didn't happen right away. So, under a tyranny.
So this is where I might disagree with Hegel here, right? I've been on with him for, honestly, I'm just early in here, so I don't really know his full argument. But from what we hear, like what I was saying before, which seems to be a little bit of a what's the term I'm looking for here? Like a disagreement with his own philosophy here. This idea. I don't know. Maybe I got to read into it next. I'll keep on before I say my piece here. This probably jumping to conclusions.
Tyranny, one man is free, one person is free. Under an aristocracy, some people are free vis-a-vis each other. Under democracy, all are free, at least politically. And he talks about this in terms of the development of religion, and how long it took to realize that everybody can have an unmediated relation to God, or everybody can be the one who's in the right vantage point. Not just the priest, not just the, we go further back, not just the arbitrary person who happened to have been born into the family that carries out the sacrifices. Each one of these things, each one of these shapes of consciousness, for Hegel, is, like I said, a hard-won achievement that we have to think through.
Okay, so yeah, I do disagree. And now again, this probably might change as we continue, but like that exact example of religion, we actually don't see that if you look at history. If you look at the anthropological, information, the data that we have so far, you actually see that the early levels of religion, or which you might call spirituality, were actually open. Were actually the idea that everybody did have this relationship with the divine, with this higher beings and stuff like that. And there were, for most cultures, there were multiple higher beings, and anybody could have any sort of relationship with them, right? Many of the early rituals were things that anybody from the culture, anybody in the community could do at any time. They're like, okay, I want to do a hunting, ritual. So they, got that together, right? You didn't have to go to some holy man to do that. That actually came later, right? This development of hierarchy in religion actually came afterwards. So in Hegel's own, argument here is not really following with the history of religion. And the same thing goes for things like what you said, like tyranny, autocracy, democracy. We don't see that in the anthropological data. What we actually see is that people were fairly egalitarian in a lot of times. Well, not necessarily. There were cultures, some of which were egalitarian, some of which were not, but they were not, linear of each other. So they could be two different, for instance, hunter gatherers. One was egalitarian, and one was not. Or they can have like a spectrum of egalitarianism, right, where they were egalitarian in some ways, but not in other ways. But in either way, this is it's like a complex tapestry of how they organize themselves, and so doing, they actually became more um, autocratic, when things like cities started to develop and start to centralize the power structures. Right, this goes into the history of egalitarianism and the development of hierarchy. And I know this because I spent 20, 30,000 words on this on this article talking about the development of hierarchy. So it's not linear, right? We didn't go from a space of tyranny into more and more democracy. If anything, we went from very much democracy into some tyranny, then go back into democracy and back into tyranny, and then tyranny spread out more and more and more. And now people are like, oh wait, let's go into democracy. So it's kind of all over the place. So yeah, this part I think I disagree with.
What do people want to do instead from the vantage point of the present as they're doing philosophy? Well, he says, in place of the long process of culture towards genuine philosophy, a movement is rich as it is profound, a movement that's very rich at each one of these points. Each one of these points was a world full of subjects that we can go back to and make sense of and appreciate. The vantage point of the present, offers is quite equivalent, one of two things. Direct revelations from heaven, God speaks through me. Or not God, world spirit speaks through me. If anybody says world spirit speaks through me in a way that doesn't take all this into account, they're not Hegelian. Science speaks through me. The enlightened masters speak through me. Pick whatever you like. The human heart. I have compassion. I have sympathy. I'm a unique individual because I was doing that before it was cool. Any of these sort of appeals to like direct intuition are rather, here's the problem with them, they're rather arbitrary. They're always carried out from the perspective of the present. They try to give us the meaning of the present. And the reason why I put these arrows here is what they do is they talk about the present, what the current gestalt is, but they don't actually advance us anywhere. They don't continue us on the process, and they don't provide us with a retrospective look back. Because if we're going to move from E, it's going to be by taking all of this and then moving forward, Hegel would say. So direct revelations from heaven, or sound common sense. And sound common sense is always the common sense of this present moment, this present culture, this group of people. Common sense is not as common, as universal as it makes itself out to be. So he says, these are presented as quite good substitutes. You might add to that, relying on textbooks or SparkNotes or Wikipedia, or, not reading Hegel and just watching these videos would fall into the same thing, I would say. You should be reading the Hegel. You should be thinking about the Hegel. He says, we're assured that these are quite good substitutes, as some claim chicory is for coffee. Chicory is
Hey, I'm reading through these videos, right? I'm reading along with you. But yeah, I definitely want to get a copy of the book and look through it and stuff like that. But honestly, if it wasn't for these videos, I wouldn't do this because I just don't have I don't have the time. I have like a million books I read. So like watching these videos allows me to like do two things at once. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's bad. I don't know. But it's how I can do it. So it's what makes it accessible for me. But yeah, I feel you on that, Dr. Sadler. I feel you on that.
It's an ersatz. It's a substitute, right? And, when you're being given a substitute, once you've actually had the real thing, you can't be quite content with it. It says, it's not a pleasant experience to see ignorance and a crudity without form and taste, which cannot focus its thought on a single abstract proposition, still less on a connected chain of them, which is what's required here. Claiming at one moment to be freedom of thought and toleration, and the next to be even genius. And, we see this in our own time as Hegel saw it in his. You're always going to have people who are really know-nothings and yet claim to be the spirit of the time, or claim that they're the ones who are going to articulate the new shape of freedom, the new shape of meaning. They usually often have great slogans, great logos, but it's all, superficial flash and there's no substance there. Now he talks about genius. This is really interesting. He says, genius, we all know, was once all the rage in poetry as it now is in philosophy. In Hegel's time, so what is genius? The idea behind genius is that you've got a person who is unique and they're somehow hyper-qualified, hyper-competent. They can't explain to you how it is that they're able to do what they do. They just do it. They're, just super extraordinary, and they're using their indenium, their gifts that are from within, and just deploying them. So why are some people great musicians? It's not because they practice more. It's not because they studied the history of music and assimilated it. They're just geniuses. If they had studied the history of music, Mozart looked at the previous musicians and saw stuff in them that we couldn't possibly fathom. Well, does that work for philosophy? Hegel says no. He says, look at how it turned out in poetry. People are saying, oh yeah, this person's a genius, this person's a genius, this person's a genius. And what did it beget? Trite prose instead of poetry. But getting beyond that, crazy rhetoric. Garbage. Genius is not a substitute for making things that really matter and last. So nowadays, philosophizing by the light of nature, which regards itself as too good for the notion, and as being an intuitive and poetic thinking, again we see the appeal to intuition, in virtue of this deficiency, brings to market the arbitrary combinations of an imagination that has only been disorganized by its thoughts, an imagery that is neither fish nor flesh, neither poetry nor philosophy. What he's saying is that geniuses are... It's not that they're not welcome in philosophy, it's just that they're not going to do any useful work. They are, in effect, dead ends. They're not going to take the process further. And the trouble is that they're going to pretend to be, and a lot of other people are going to look at them and puff them up as the wave of the future. It's work. It's the patience, the labor of the negative, the hard work that's required to enter into the phenomena themselves, to subject oneself to them, especially when those phenomena are the past history of human consciousness. Adapting yourself to another person's consciousness, that takes an awful lot of work. Coming up with BS that you pull just out of the air or out of your feelings or out of, mishmashing thoughts or randomizing things or just trying to, one-up everybody, that's not very hard. Right. But it doesn't lead you anywhere. Studying this, assimilating yourself to that, following through on it, lets you have the possibility of moving beyond.
Hmm.
Hegel would be perfectly willing to say, I'm not a genius. I actually am not even a dwarf on the shoulders of giants. I am just consciousness on the shoulder of giants. And I'm able to bring these things together in part because I've assimilated all
Mm.
this past stuff and thought about it. And if it weren't for them, I couldn't be where I am. It's not that I've got this thing within, inside of me that's, a special talent for systematization or anything like that. And it's not like, sound common sense is suggesting this procedure to me. I'm actually pretty alone while I'm putting this together in 1807.
Hmm.
Rather, it's that I have followed out the past developments, the dialectical developments of these shapes of consciousness, and now I see where we can go from here.
Mm. I love that. I love that. Yeah, I say that all the time. Like, folks, not to say like I'm, up there or anything like that, but the few things I put out there, some people will be like, "Oh, this is amazing. You really got your hand on the pulse or whatever." I'm like, "Nah, I just read." I'm just like putting together some things that I've learned from all these other people out there. If you really want to learn, go look at that. Go look at that. I'm just a congregator or whatever you want to call it. I just bring these points together. I just put stuff together. And even now with this channel, like that's kind of what I'm trying to do. That's why one side I'm talking about anarchy, another side I'm talking about Hegel, another side I'm talking about design. Granted, I haven't been talking about design enough. Another side I'm talking about anthropology and stuff like that, because I want to draw these points together. Look at all the amazing knowledge and stuff that people have learned over the ages and in all these areas of expertise, and bring that together. And I think that the more that we do that, the more that we can really have a better understanding of where we are today and where we can be going. And I wish more people do that, as well. So yeah, it's really cool to see this. This was another great video, another great section. And as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and have a discussion. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.